Hey everyone, in this episode I'm about to share a chilling first-hand encounter that happened to Josh and his friend Jake while camping deep in the woods of South Carolina. This isn't some made-up creepypasta or dramatized retelling for views. What I'm going to describe to you is 100% real, and it still haunts them to this day. Josh needed to get this story off of his chest, because holding it in and trying to rationalize what happened has been eating him alive for months now. So if you're watching this late at night, you may want to have the lights on, because the details I'm about to go into are going to have you looking over your shoulder, guaranteed. So get comfortable, hit that subscribe button, and prepare to have your idea of what's real completely shattered. Because I have proof that there are forces at work beyond human comprehension, and they have a way of revealing themselves when you least expect it. I've never really bought into the whole ghost thing, at least not until my terrifying encounter in the South Carolina woods last year. I still get chills thinking about it. It was a cool October night when my friend Jake and I decided to go camping in the Marion National Forest outside of Charleston, South Carolina. We'd been buddies since childhood and loved getting out in nature whenever we could. This place was one of our favorite spots, secluded, with miles of trails winding through the forest. The first night was totally normal. We set up our tents, made a campfire, cracked some drinks, and caught up on things. Around 11 p.m., we finally turned in, exhausted from the day's hike. I remember falling asleep pretty much instantly. But then, sometime after 2 a.m., I woke up feeling unsettled. I could sense that something wasn't right. At first, I thought I was just hearing an animal scurrying around outside the tent. But then I noticed the temperature seemed to have dropped significantly. My breath was visible, whereas it wasn't before, and I could see it clouding up the tent. That's when the fear started to set in. I slowly and silently unzipped the tent and stepped outside to get a better look around. The woods were dead silent. Not even a cricket chirping or leaves rustling. An eerie stillness hung over everything. I peered into the trees, my eyes struggling to adjust. That's when I noticed a faint, hovering light about 50 yards away. As it slowly drifted closer, I could make out a human-like figure surrounded by a dim, bluish glow. I felt my whole body tense up as the realization hit me. I was looking at an apparition of some kind. As it approached, clearer details started to emerge. The ghostly figure looked to be that of a man, wearing what seemed to be old, tattered clothing from the early 1800s. Tattered fabric hung from its body, and its face was gaunt with sunken eyes. It glided towards me with an ominous, purposeful movement, not touching the ground. I stood there, paralyzed by shock and fear. A part of me couldn't believe what I was seeing, but the image burned into my mind was as real and vivid as anything. The ghastly figure drifted to within about 20 feet of me before stopping abruptly. In the iridescent glow, I could make out its mouth opening, as if trying to speak, but no sound came out. The feeling of dread was overwhelming, along with 1,000 other swirling emotions and unanswered questions. Who was this restless spirit, and what did it want from me? Why did it appear now, in this remote place, for me to see it? Just when I thought I couldn't take the tension any longer, the ghostly figure turned and began drifting away, slowly fading into the tree line until it had vanished completely. As it disappeared, the eerie quiet and chill in the air went with it, and everything seemed to return to normal. Shaken to my core, I scrambled back to the tent and shook Jake awake. When I breathlessly told him what I'd just witnessed, he looked at me like I was insane. Of course, he didn't believe me. I could barely wrap my own head around it all. I barely slept the rest of the night, and at first light I convinced him to waste no time packing up and getting the hell out of there as fast as we could. During the silent drive home, I kept replaying every chilling moment over and over, fighting against the urge to convince myself it was all some kind of vivid nightmare. In the weeks after, I spent hours researching the history of that area, looking for any clues or legends that might shed some light on what I encountered. That's what was disturbing me the most, the lack of a logical, rational explanation. Turns out, back in the early 1800s, there was a village in that area inhabited by the Chichora tribe, one of the indigenous peoples who lived in the South Carolina Lowcountry for centuries before Europeans arrived. According to the documentation I found, this particular village was raided by American soldiers in 1815 during wartime conflicts. The soldiers were under orders to remove the Chichora from their ancestral lands by any means necessary. What unfolded was a bloody massacre where countless innocent women, children, and elders were slaughtered in cold blood while the warriors were away. It was a vicious act of genocide that essentially wiped the Chichora tribe from existence in one fell swoop. As I read the grisly accounts, the pieces started falling into place. The tattered clothing and emaciated features I witnessed seemed to match the time period and living conditions perfectly, and the vacant, mournful expression struck me as one of unimaginable suffering and sorrow. I realized with dawning horror that the apparition was likely the restless spirit of a Chichora man who returned from that fateful hunting trip to find his entire village, his wife, children, parents, everyone he knew, lying massacred. His anguish and thirst for justice so powerful that his anguished soul became permanently tethered to those sacred grounds where his people were so tragically extinguished. For over 200 years, his tormented spirit has wandered that forest, still consumed by inconsolable grief and a burning need to somehow convey the atrocities that his people endured. His silent cries for recognition and remembrance echoing through the centuries, until finally locking eyes with me on that fateful night. As crazy as it sounds, I can't help but wonder if I was meant to bear witness to this long-suffered injustice, to finally give this restless soul's people a voice that was so violently taken from them 2 centuries ago. Maybe, just maybe, by sharing this experience far and wide, I can finally bring some justice and peace to the drifting, agonized spirit of the Chichora man. I know there will always be skeptics and people who write my story off as pure fiction or delirium, but I saw what I saw, and in my bones, I know that the paranormal is truly real. Forces are at work in this world beyond our comprehension as mortal humans. I think that sometimes the veil separating our plane of existence gets thin enough for beings to cross over, whether they're malicious or simply weary souls looking to tell their stories. Well, that stands to be determined. Thanks again for letting me share this story with you. I work as an accountant for the Department of the Interior in Washington, DC most days. My job is pretty mundane, sitting at a desk, crunching numbers, going over budgets and financial reports. But a few months ago, I had an encounter that was anything but ordinary. It was a Wednesday evening in late September. Thanks to an upcoming fiscal year-end deadline, I had been pulling long hours and working overtime all week. I didn't end up leaving the office until well after 10 p.m. that night. As I headed to the parking garage, I remember feeling exhausted and eager to get home. That's when I first noticed the strange, putrid smell hanging in the air. It was like a noxious combination of rotten eggs and sickly sweet decay. I figured a sewage line must have ruptured nearby, but there were no work crews or any obvious signs of a leak. Then again, this is a city, and so who knows what could be happening. As I approached my car, I heard a low, guttural rumbling that made me stop dead in my tracks. The sound seemed to reverberate through the concrete garage, like the faraway growl of a massive creature. I slowly turned towards the source of the noise, my eyes finally landing on this thing. Crouched behind one of the wide concrete pillars was a creature I couldn't begin to describe or make sense of. It was roughly the size of a full-grown grizzly bear, but that's where any sense of familiarity ended. Its body seemed almost reptilian or amphibious. covered in overlapping scales and thick, leathery skin that glistened with some sort of viscous mucus under the harsh fluorescent lighting. Instead of fur or hair, bony ridges protruded along its hunched back like jagged spines. As it turned its elongated head towards me, I could see its mouth was filled with rows of long, jagged teeth that seemed too large for its jaw to properly accommodate. Ropes of drool and phlegm oozed from between those dagger-like fangs, but the most unsettling feature by far were its eyes, large, unblinking orbs with brilliant red irises that appeared to glow and pulsate. In that moment, time seemed to grind to a halt. My body locked up, frozen in place by sheer terror. This thing couldn't possibly be of this world. Maybe it was some kind of genetic experiment gone horribly wrong, or perhaps the byproduct of toxic spills or radiation leaks that the public is not aware of. Part of me didn't want to believe what I was seeing was real, that it had to be some sort of shadow. But the overwhelming stench and the inhuman snarls it let out left no doubt in my mind that this was no dream. The creature seemed to notice me gawking at it and pulled its lipless jaws back, unleashing a hair-raising roar that made my ears ring. When it did so, strands of phlegm and mucus splattered the nearby pillar. I wanted to run as fast as I could, to do anything other than just stand there like a petrified idiot, but I couldn't make my legs move an inch. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a matter of seconds, the beast dropped down onto all fours, leaning forward into an attack posture with its tail raised high. Then, with a few powerful bounds, it was gone, fleeing down a side corridor and out of sight with remarkable speed for something so large. I remained in that exact spot for several long minutes, my heart thundering against my ribcage so violently I thought it might burst through. Sweat poured down my face and back, despite the chill of the garage. Had I really just seen that thing? Or was I finally cracking under the stress of overwork and fatigue? No, I knew it was real. The stench still burned my nostrils, and the sound of its roars still rang in my ears. Adrenaline finally kicked in, and I bolted for my car, fumbling with the keys and locks with trembling hands. I peeled out of the garage, ignoring stop signs, and just focused on putting as much distance between myself and that place as possible. When I finally made it home, I was still a sweaty, shaking mess. My wife immediately knew something was very wrong, and I struggled to find the words to describe what happened. I think she could tell from the wild look in my eyes that I had experienced something utterly outside the realm of normal reality. In the days and weeks afterwards, I went through a range of emotions: fear, doubt, anxiety. Part of me wanted to report the sighting to someone, the authorities, animal control, anyone. But another part of me worried that doing so could have unforeseen, even disastrous consequences that I couldn't begin to guess at. What if this thing was some sort of government experiment or extraterrestrial being, and making its existence public knowledge put me or my loved ones at risk of retaliation? So for now, I've kept the details of that night to myself, pivoting away anytime friends or family ask what's been bothering me lately. But that snarling image has haunted my dreams ever since, making appearances in my brain whenever I dare to let my guard down. Sometimes late at night, I'll catch myself replaying those horrific moments over and over, paralyzed by the nagging fear that it's still out there somewhere, lurking and slithering through the darkness. I try not to let the dread consume me, but I can't seem to shake the feeling that one night I'll turn a corner and run into it again. So I go about my days on guard and on edge, trying my best to stay focused on work and my normal routine. But that slobbering, scaly, crimson-eyed horror creeps into the back of my mind whenever I'm alone for too long. I'm just hoping that all of this ends as soon as possible. Hi, my name is Lily, and I am a 22-year-old girl from Carlisle, Pennsylvania. What I'm about to describe sounds straight out of a horror movie, but I swear on my life that every word is true. This happened to me and my friend Abby just a few months ago in October 2023. It was one of those perfect fall evenings in central PA, crisp air, clear skies, the forest leaves just hitting peak autumn colors. Abby and I are avid hikers who've tackled a bunch of challenging trails in the region. For this particular trip, we decided to go night hiking along a section of the Appalachian Trail that cuts through Michaud State Forest near Boiling Springs. We loaded up my car with our hiking packs, headlamps, plenty of food and water, and an emergency supply kit. After driving to the trailhead parking lot, we started our hike around 8 p.m. once full darkness had settled in. The trail was fairly flat for the first couple miles as it wound through a dense forest of oak, maple, and pine trees. Around 10:15 p.m., we came to a sloping downhill stretch where the trail narrowed considerably. That's when we first heard something large moving through the underbrush up ahead. It sounded bigger than a deer based on the heavy crushing of branches and leaves. We stopped to listen better, shining our headlamps toward the noise. That's when this massive, bulking shape stood upright on the trail, maybe 50 yards in front of us. Our headlamp beams reflected bright red from its eyes, which were grotesquely wide set on a face that looked simultaneously ape-like and human. Its entire body appeared covered in shaggy, dark fur or hair. Abby and I just went totally rigid, afraid of making any sudden movements. In a frantic whisper, I asked her, "Do you see what I'm seeing?" She nodded, her eyes wide with terror. That's when the creature opened its mouth and let out a sound that shook the forest all around us. It was part lion's roar, part deep, groaning bellow. The ferocity of it vibrated through my entire body, making my bones rattle. Abby screamed out loud, unable to contain herself. In an instant, the creature's head swiveled toward us, the red eyes locking right onto our positions. It took 2 incredibly large strides toward us, clearing at least 25 feet with each step. "Run!" I yelled to Abby, not waiting for her response before turning and bolting back the way we'd come as fast as my legs could carry me. I could hear her footsteps right behind me, along with the sounds of massive bipedal movement crashing through the woods in hot pursuit. I've never been so scared in my entire life. Every fiber of my being was screaming at me to not look back, but I couldn't resist. About 150 yards behind us, I could see its towering silhouette charging after us, snapping branches and uprooting vegetation like it was mowing a trail. "Oh God, it's gaining on us," Abby cried out. "We'll never outrun it." I had no response, no words of comfort. I could feel the ground shaking with each of its thunderous steps. We ran and ran, making desperate zigzag motions away from the trail in hopes of shaking its pursuit. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 to 15 minutes of sheer sprinting terror through the forest, the sounds of massive movement and snapping branches started to recede into the distance behind us. We eventually emerged at the trailhead near my truck, utterly drained and wheezing for air. I remember collapsing to the ground, fingers clutching at the dirt and leaves as I gasped, "What the hell was that thing?" Abby was beside herself, crying hysterically about how we almost just got killed. We got out of those woods as fast as humanly possible, not caring about recovering any gear or supplies left behind on the trail. By the time the local ranger station opened in the morning, we were at the office giving a terrified account of our encounter. A few search parties went in to check for footprints, disturbed areas, any evidence at all of the creature's presence. As far as I know, they came up totally empty-handed. It was like the whole night was just some crazy shared hallucination between me and Abby. But we both agree that we saw something for real. We know what we heard. We know we were pursued by some sort of enormous, bipedal humanoid monster. To this day, I have no idea if it was some sort of undiscovered primate, an alien being, or maybe even an interdimensional entity. All I can say is that the encounter was 100% real, and neither Abby nor I will ever set foot on that trail ever again. Whatever that thing was, it was incredibly powerful, lightning fast, loud beyond belief, and seemed totally unafraid of humans. Like I said, I know how crazy this all sounds, but it happened, and it still haunts my dreams almost nightly. If you have any theories about what we encountered, I'd love to hear them, because I'm still just as mystified today as when I was frantically running for my life through those dark, terrible woods. Thanks for listening. Have you ever been out in pure darkness? And I'm not talking city darkness where there's always some streetlight messing up your night vision. I'm talking about true midnight, when you're miles from people and civilization, that kind of darkness. That's the darkness of Yosemite National Park at night. A few years back, I used to take long walks there, just me under the black velvet of the night sky dotted with more stars than you can ever count. I know, sounds kinda creepy to some, but I grew up around woods and fields, so being out on a night like that feels like home. There's something about the pure solitude and the primal bit of fear it stirs up that makes you feel more alive. I think it makes the senses sharper too, reminding you that you're part of nature, not just an observer. On this particular night, I went for my usual late-night stroll in the park. The moon was big and hanging low in the sky, bathing Yosemite Valley in an eerie silver glow. There's something really beautiful about moonlight, the way it drapes everything in soft silver and blue. I started near the northern edge of the park. I remember slipping on my hiking boots and grabbing my flashlight, although I hardly ever had to switch it on. I headed off under the tall, black silhouettes of the giant sequoias. But truth be told, the whole stroll didn't feel right from the start. You know that tingle you get sometimes, like an itch in a spot you can't scratch? It was that kind of feeling. Maybe it was the way the moonlight was reflecting off the lake, or was it the way the night felt quieter than normal? I can't say for sure. I brushed off the feeling and continued on walking along a narrow path skirting around a cliffside. There was a steep drop on my left and a wall of rock on my right. And then I hear something in the distance, an odd, softly echo kind of clicking sound. Now, I've heard all sorts of critters making all sorts of noises, but this was different. Not so much the click, click, click rhythm of it, but it was the quality, I guess. It had a strange, hollow, and almost chiming sound. I stopped and listened. It was getting louder, seemingly alternating between the left and right of me. So I did something I almost never do. I switched on my flashlight. That's when I saw these strange marks on the ground. The pale beam of my flashlight played over the dust and the pine needles, and there they were, these long, dragging marks, like something had been crawling along the path. They were fresh, too. The dust was still settling. Now, I'd tracked all sorts of animals, but these tracks were something else, erratic and just plain wrong for any type of creature that lived in the area. I followed the marks, my unease growing with every step. Suddenly, the rustle of dry leaves under my boots seemed to grow louder. I stopped mid-step, a drop of cold sweat sliding down my back. You know how in those Predator movies, everything goes quiet before the beast shows up? That's exactly how it felt. I was being watched. I was sure of it now, but I couldn't see anything past the puny circle of light from the beam of my flashlight. The once comforting moonlight now cast long, alien shadows that seemed to play tricks on my eyes. Then, out of nowhere, I caught sight of something in the periphery of the flashlight's glow. Whatever it was darting between the trees. It was so fast that I couldn't make out what it was at first. But then it slowed, almost as if it had stopped to watch me. The sight of it was terrifying. Almost human, but not quite. This thing was naked and pale. It was as if it was made from moonlight. It was on all fours, skittering and crawling, its joints bending all the wrong ways. Its elongated form was almost fluid in movement, and it spanned a height that I guess was about 5 feet when stretched out. The body was gaunt, almost skeletal, with every vertebrae showing under the tight, stretched skin. It gave off a strange clicking noise, like teeth chattering. That was the noise I had been hearing earlier. The sound was echoing around the canyon. Then it turned its head, and I saw its face. 2 hollow voids where eyes should be, pitch black against its pallid face. No nose, just a wide, gaping mouth that looked like a yawning chasm in its skull. Before I could react, it lunged towards me, quick as a flash. Panicked, I stumbled back, nearly dropping my flashlight as I turned and ran the way I came, stumbling over roots and blindly crashing through the undergrowth. Thankfully, I was close enough to the head of the trail that I managed to make it back to my car while the creature, whatever it was, didn't seem to follow me past the tree line. To this day, I don't know what the hell that thing was. I've gone over that night in my head 100 times, trying to rationalize it. It was too big for any nocturnal critter I know, too fast for a prankster in a suit, and way too real to be a hallucination. I guess some things aren't meant to be explained, but it's given me a real respect for the darkness and those quiet little corners of the world where the wild things lurk. I was a volunteer firefighter when those really bad wildfires hit in Northern California. I'm actually from Idaho, but they flew me and some of my friends down there to help out because the blaze was so out of control. It's just unimaginable destruction and made me really sad to see all the homes and neighborhoods totally destroyed. They had us camping a good distance away from any of the fires, and every night someone was on watch and radio. We were always on high alert because with the change of the wind, miles could easily turn into minutes. I had been there for a week, maybe a week and a half. We had just pulled a 15 or 16-hour day, and we were finishing up dinner, so probably close to 11 or 12 at night. This guy Casey comes running over and tells us to follow him to the back of camp. I mean, saying back of camp is generous because that group had maybe 25 or 30 tents. Anyway, we followed him over to near the train tracks, and he was yelling about a weird sound he'd heard while taking a smoke. I couldn't hear anything, and neither could anyone else, but Casey was never like this. He was super chill and never made a big deal about anything. I think he was an English teacher or something at one point. I didn't know him super well. I had only worked with him once before. It was getting dark, but the fires were keeping it somewhat light out, so you could still sort of see what was happening. There was an overall glow to the situation. Casey had a pretty big head start on us, and we soon lost him in some trees up ahead. It was sometime right around then when the wind decided to change. The fire got to us quickly. But you see, the thing is that the fire was there way too fast. It should have taken an hour at least to make the distance that it did. But somehow, all of a sudden, everything was blazing. The trees, the grass, the wood of the railroad tracks. I saw that the metal of the railroad tracks was also on fire. None of this was normal. Everything was happening too fast. We were surrounded on every side by walls of fire, and it was closing in on us. I looked up, and the flames were above us too. I thought I was imagining it at first, but then Nancy, the other lady on the team, started yelling through the roar of the fire. Do you hear that? It was a strange cross between a hiss and a hum. It was deep and at the same time high-pitched. Not only could I hear it, but I could feel it under my skin. The fire brightened up where Casey had disappeared. Then the ground began to rumble, and I realized the hissing was coming from below. A giant sort of fireball exploded upwards in front of us. The fire around us grew lower, except for in front of us where it grew even brighter. And that's when I saw what looked like the outline of a person deep in the fire. I thought it was Casey, but the closer I looked, the stranger it appeared and the less and less it looked like Casey. It was hard to tell, but the thing was probably 7 or 8 feet tall. There was no way someone could withstand that heat either. It would be impossible. The shrieky humming grew louder, and I realized the figure was running towards us. Its front limbs were long, swinging until it got closer, and then it felt like it was reaching towards me. I dove out of the way to avoid it, and the flames were trailing it. It could have even been the source of the fire. I'm not sure. It was all so confusing. The second before I blacked out, I rolled over and got a glimpse of the thing's legs, which looked like the hind legs of an animal, maybe a horse or a goat or something like that based on their strange angle. I woke up and didn't know how long I'd been out, but it must have been a while because it was starting to get light out, and not just from the nearby wildfires. The sun was coming up, and I could see I wasn't the only one who had passed out. Nancy and some of the guys were nearby on the ground too. Others were also just coming around and waking up. I checked on them all, and they were alive and breathing, but still out cold. I looked around and saw a giant hole where part of the railroad track had been. Some of the metal had melted and dripped down the side of the hole. I remember thinking it looked like icicles. I went to the edge of the hole, which was more like a pit, probably at least 10 or 15 feet deep. The sides of it were caked in ash, and smoke was rising from the center. Turning around, I realized that nothing had actually been burned. The railroad track had melted a bit, and a few feet on either side of the pit were a little charred. But everything else was unburnt. Green grass and weeds. The trees were still covered in needles, and the trunks were untouched. There was a stripe, or maybe path, of grass that had been kind of crisped. It went from the pit and then up and over the hill in the direction of the wildfires. Once everyone woke up and we were all able to determine that no one was too badly hurt, we searched for 3 or 4 hours, but couldn't find any sign of Casey. Had he been hurt? Taken by that thing I saw? Or, stranger yet, had he morphed into that thing? I'm not sure what I saw, and after talking to the others, it turns out we all saw it before passing out. And now there are just so many questions that I'm overwhelmed beyond belief. Does anyone out there have any answers that can help me?